My parents rolled their eyes and smirked when I walked into that courtroom wearing my crisp navy suit, assuming I was there to beg for their forgiveness. The judge looked up from her bench, recognized me immediately, and her expression transformed into something I will never forget. Complete and utter shock that left my parents' smug faces frozen in confusion. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I stepped out of the high-rise office building in downtown Seattle at 7:15 on that Thursday evening in late September. My leather portfolio tucked under my arm and exhaustion settling into my bones like a familiar weight. The autumn air carried that distinctive Pacific Northwest chill that arrived earlier each year, cutting through my burgundy blazer and making me wish I had remembered to grab my heavier coat from the office closet before leaving. My reflection in the glass door showed exactly what I felt. A 31-year-old corporate attorney who had just billed her 14th hour of the day, with at least 3 more hours of document review waiting for me back at my apartment. I worked as an associate attorney at Pemberton & Associates, a mid-sized firm specializing in intellectual property law and corporate litigation. The position represented everything I had worked toward since deciding to attend law school 8 years earlier, surviving 3 brutal years at the University of Washington School of Law, enduring the anxiety of bar exam preparation, and clawing my way through 2 years as a junior associate before finally earning my current position. The work itself fascinated me when I had the mental energy to appreciate it. Helping tech startups protect their innovations, navigating complex patent disputes, drafting licensing agreements that would govern relationships between companies for years to come. On good days, I felt like I was building something meaningful, contributing to an ecosystem of innovation and entrepreneurship that defined Seattle's economic landscape. On days like this particular Thursday, however, I mostly felt tired. The case I had been working on for the past 6 weeks involved a software company accused of violating trade secrets by a former partner, and the discovery phase had generated approximately 40,000 pages of documents that needed reviewing, categorizing, and analyzing for relevance to our defense strategy. My eyes ached from staring at computer screens since 6:30 that morning, reviewing email chains and technical specifications that all started to blur together after the 10th consecutive hour. My neck carried tension from hunching over my desk, and my feet throbbed in the practical but unforgiving pumps I wore to maintain professional appearance standards even when I would not be appearing in court. The paralegal who worked most closely with me, a remarkably organized woman named Sandra who had been with the firm for 15 years, had left at 5:30 with an apologetic smile and a promise to continue the document review first thing Friday morning. I had waved her off with genuine warmth, insisting she should go home to her family and enjoy her evening. Sandra had 2 teenage daughters and a husband who actually seemed to appreciate her, a family dynamic so foreign to my own experience that I sometimes found myself envious of her rush to leave the office each evening. She had somewhere to be, people who looked forward to her arrival, a home that felt welcoming rather than simply functional. My apartment in the Capitol Hill neighborhood was a 1-bedroom unit on the 4th floor of a building constructed in the 1920s, featuring the kind of architectural character that real estate listings enthusiastically described as vintage charm, but which translated practically into inadequate electrical outlets, temperamental radiator heat, and windows that required precise manipulation to open or close properly. I had moved there 3 years earlier when I accepted the position at Pemberton & Associates, choosing the location for its reasonable commute to downtown, and its proximity to coffee shops where I could work on weekends when the office felt too isolating. The rent consumed a substantial portion of my salary, but Seattle housing costs had long since passed the point where anyone could afford to be particularly selective, unless they earned partner-level income or had family money supporting them. I had neither. Everything I had achieved professionally had come through scholarships, student loans that I would be repaying well into my 40s, and an almost pathological dedication to succeeding through sheer force of will and competence. My undergraduate degree in political science from Seattle University had been funded primarily through academic scholarships and work-study positions that had me shelving books in the library and tutoring freshmen in writing composition. Law school had required taking on staggering debt that I tried not to calculate too precisely because the total amount triggered anxiety that interfered with sleep. The apartment, the professional wardrobe, the bar association dues, the continuing legal education requirements, the student loan payments that consumed nearly a quarter of my monthly income, All of it represented the cost of building a career in a field where credibility and appearance mattered almost as much as actual competence. My phone vibrated in my coat pocket as I waited for the light to change at the intersection of 4th and Union, the street still busy with evening commuters heading toward the light rail station or the bus stops that would carry them north toward the University District or south toward the neighborhoods clustered around Beacon Hill. I pulled out the device and saw my mother's name displayed across the screen, accompanied by a photo from 5 years earlier showing her smiling at a family dinner that now felt like it had occurred in a different lifetime entirely. My finger hovered over the accept button while my stomach performed that familiar clenching motion that accompanied most interactions with my parents, a Pavlovian response developed over 3 decades of conversations that reliably left me feeling inadequate, misunderstood, or vaguely guilty about choices I had made for perfectly legitimate reasons. I answered the call despite my better judgment, some combination of daughterly obligation and curiosity overriding my instinct to let it go to voicemail and deal with whatever she wanted during my lunch break the following day. My mother's voice came through with that particular brightness that I had learned to recognize as a warning sign, a tone she adopted when she wanted something or was about to deliver news that she anticipated I would not receive positively. The cheerfulness felt artificial, rehearsed, as though she had practiced the conversation before making the call. She began with pleasantries that felt perfunctory, asking about my work in that vague way that people employ when they have no genuine interest in the answer but recognize that social convention requires demonstrating some level of concern about the other person's life before transitioning to their actual agenda. I provided equally vague responses about being busy with a challenging case, keeping my answers brief while trying to gauge where this conversation was heading based on subtle cues in her tone and pacing. My mother had never been particularly skilled at disguising her intentions, and I had spent enough years learning to read the signs that I could usually predict the direction of a conversation within the first minute. The real purpose of the call emerged after approximately 90 seconds of preliminary small talk. My younger sister Vanessa was getting married in 3 weeks. She informed me with that bright artificial enthusiasm still firmly in place. The wedding would take place at a vineyard in Woodinville, a ceremony and reception for approximately 150 guests, followed by a honeymoon in Italy that would last 2 full weeks. The groom was a man named Derek whom Vanessa had been dating for 18 months, a financial analyst who worked for one of the major investment firms downtown, and who apparently came from a family with the kind of generational wealth that made expensive weddings and European honeymoons seem like reasonable expectations rather than extravagant luxuries. I had met Derek exactly twice, both times at family dinners where he had been polite but largely uninterested in conversation with me, directing most of his attention toward my parents and responding to my attempts at dialogue with brief answers that did not invite follow-up questions. My impression had been that he found me either boring or vaguely threatening, perhaps both, though I had not invested much energy in analyzing his motivations because my relationship with Vanessa had been strained for years, and I had learned to maintain emotional distance from her life choices to preserve my own peace of mind. Vanessa was 26, 5 years younger than me, and had followed a life trajectory that my parents found much more comprehensible and praiseworthy than my own path. She had attended community college for 2 years before transferring to the University of Washington, graduating with a degree in communications that she had never particularly utilized in any focused career direction. She had worked a series of administrative positions at various companies, each lasting between 8 months and 2 years before she would grow bored or frustrated and move on to something else that captured her temporary interest. Her resume read like someone who was perpetually searching for purpose, but lacked the patience or discipline to invest in developing expertise in any particular area. My parents had always seemed perfectly content with Vanessa's approach to life, praising her social skills and her ability to make friends easily, interpreting her job hopping as evidence of someone exploring options rather than someone lacking commitment or direction. When she had moved back into their house at 24 after a roommate situation had fallen apart, they had welcomed her return as a natural and temporary arrangement, never expressing concern about whether she was developing the independence and financial stability that adulthood traditionally required. When she had continued living there for 2 years while dating Derek and spending money on entertainment and clothes rather than saving for her own place, they had characterized it as sensible financial planning rather than extended adolescence. The contrast with how they had treated my choices had always been striking enough to generate resentment that I generally tried to suppress or rationalize away. When I had lived at home during my undergraduate years to save money, commuting to campus rather than taking on housing costs, they had frequently commented on how I should be having more fun and making more friends instead of always studying. When I had worked multiple jobs during law school to minimize my debt burden, they had suggested I was being too serious and missing out on the social aspects of the law school experience that could lead to valuable networking connections. When I had chosen intellectual property law over criminal prosecution or family law, fields they understood more readily because they appeared frequently in television dramas, they had seemed vaguely disappointed that I was not doing something they perceived as more noble or socially beneficial. My mother continued explaining details about Vanessa's upcoming wedding, while I walked the remaining blocks toward the bus stop, half listening while mentally reviewing the documents I still needed to analyze when I returned to my apartment. The wedding colors were dusty rose and sage green, she informed me. The ceremony would begin at 4:30 in the afternoon to take advantage of the golden hour lighting for photographs. The reception would feature a live band rather than a DJ because Derek's family had strong opinions about maintaining elegance and sophistication throughout the event. A professional wedding planner had been coordinating everything for the past 6 months, ensuring that every detail met the standards appropriate for the kind of celebration that would properly reflect both families' standing in the community. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The cost of this wedding, I calculated silently while my mother talked, likely exceeded my entire annual salary before taxes. The venue rental alone for a Woodinville vineyard during peak wedding season would run $15,000 to $20,000 at minimum. The catering costs for 150 guests would easily reach another $25,000 when factoring in the open bar that my mother mentioned in passing. Photography and videography from the award-winning team that Vanessa had selected would account for another $8,000 to $10,000. The flowers, the music, the coordination services, the invitations, the rehearsal dinner. The total was climbing towards 6 figures for a single day of celebration for 2 people who had known each other less than 2 years. My mother finally arrived at the actual purpose of her call, the request that had been lurking beneath the surface of this entire conversation. She needed a favor, she said, her tone shifting slightly to incorporate a note of assumed agreement, as though the favor had already been granted and she was simply confirming logistics. Vanessa wanted me to be in the wedding party, standing up as a bridesmaid alongside 4 of Vanessa's closest friends and Derek's sister. The bridesmaid dresses had already been selected, a floor-length gown in dusty rose that would need to be ordered immediately to ensure it arrived with enough time for alterations. The cost would be approximately $350, not including alterations, shoes, or the required professional hair and makeup services for the wedding day itself. Additionally, my mother continued before I could formulate a response, there would be a bachelorette party in 2 weeks involving a weekend trip to Portland that would include spa services, dining at upscale restaurants, and a wine tasting tour. My contribution for that weekend would be approximately $600 to cover accommodations, activities, and group meals. There would also be a bridal shower the weekend before the wedding, for which I would be expected to contribute to the catering costs and provide a gift from Vanessa's registry. The dress rehearsal would require taking time off work, as would the wedding day itself, meaning I would need to use 2 of my limited paid time off days for an event I had minimal personal investment in attending. I stopped walking, standing on the sidewalk while other pedestrians flowed around me like water around a stone, my mind rapidly calculating the total financial and time commitment being requested. Between the dress, the alterations, the shoes, the required hair and makeup services, the bachelorette weekend, the shower contribution, and a wedding gift of appropriate value for someone marrying into wealth, I was looking at a minimum expenditure of $2,000, possibly closer to $2,500 depending on various factors. This represented approximately 15% of my remaining income after rent, student loans, and basic living expenses for the entire year. $2,000 that could have gone toward my student loan principal, reducing the total amount of interest I would pay over the life of the loans. $2,000 that could have funded an emergency savings cushion that I desperately needed, but had never managed to build because every spare dollar went toward debt repayment. More significantly than the money, however, was the assumption embedded in this request. My mother had not asked whether I wanted to be a bridesmaid or whether this timing worked with my professional obligations. She had not inquired about my relationship with Vanessa or acknowledged that we barely spoke beyond obligatory exchanges at family gatherings. She had simply informed me of expectations and assumed compliance, operating from a framework where family obligations superseded personal preferences or practical limitations. The request had been framed as a favor, but the tone made clear that refusal would be interpreted as a hostile act, a rejection not just of Vanessa but of family loyalty itself. I found my voice finally, asking carefully about the timeline and whether Vanessa had specifically requested my participation, or whether this was an arrangement my mother had orchestrated to maintain family appearances. The question emerged more diplomatically than my internal reaction warranted, years of professional training and measured communication overriding my impulse to simply refuse outright. My mother's response confirmed my suspicion without explicitly acknowledging it. She said that of course Vanessa wanted me there, that sisters should stand up for each other at important life events, that family members supported each other during significant milestones regardless of whatever minor disagreements or different life paths might have created some distance between us over the years. The characterization of our relationship as featuring minor disagreements felt like a significant understatement. Vanessa and I had not had a meaningful conversation in approximately 3 years, not since a family dinner where she had made dismissive comments about my career choice, suggesting that I had become boring and overly serious, that I had traded having a real life for a job that consumed all my time and energy without providing any genuine fulfillment or happiness. I had responded with more restraint than the comment deserved, pointing out that my career provided financial independence and intellectual challenge, that not everyone measured life success by the same metrics, that different paths worked for different people. She had rolled her eyes and changed the subject, and we had maintained surface-level politeness ever since while carefully avoiding any substantive interaction. My parents had witnessed that exchange and others like it without ever addressing the underlying dynamics or suggesting that Vanessa's dismissive attitude toward my choices was inappropriate or hurtful. They had instead adopted a position of studied neutrality that somehow always seemed to implicitly validate Vanessa's perspective, while characterizing my reactions as evidence of being overly sensitive or unable to take a joke. The pattern had been consistent throughout our adult lives. Vanessa's choices were accepted and celebrated, while mine were tolerated with a sort of puzzled disappointment, as though they had expected better from their eldest daughter, and could not quite understand where they had gone wrong in raising someone so focused on career achievement rather than the traditional markers of female success like marriage and family. I told my mother I would need to think about it, that I would need to check my work schedule and my financial situation before committing to something this significant. The response was immediate and sharp, the artificial brightness dropping away to reveal frustration beneath. There was no time to think about it, she informed me with an edge in her voice. The dress needed to be ordered immediately, the bachelorette weekend was already planned and deposits had been placed that would be lost if numbers changed, and Vanessa was already stressed enough about wedding planning, without having to wonder whether her own sister would be there to support her on the most important day of her life. The implication was clear. Refusal would constitute a betrayal of such magnitude that it would fundamentally damage already fragile family relationships beyond any possibility of repair. I ended the call with a non-committal statement about getting back to her soon, unwilling to be pressured into an immediate decision but also unwilling to provoke the confrontation that an outright refusal would trigger while standing on a Seattle sidewalk at 7:30 in the evening with a 14-hour workday behind me and document review still waiting ahead. My mother accepted this temporary evasion with barely concealed irritation, reminding me one final time that Vanessa needed to know soon, that this was important, that family meant showing up for each other, even when it was inconvenient or challenging. The bus ride to my neighborhood passed in a blur of mental calculation and emotional processing. I stared out the window at the passing streets without really seeing them, my mind occupied with attempting to untangle the web of obligation, resentment, financial pressure, and familial expectation that had been dropped into my lap with that single phone call. Part of me recognized that the request itself was not inherently unreasonable. People did ask siblings to participate in wedding parties, and the associated costs, while significant, fell within the general range of what such participation typically required. If my relationship with Vanessa had been warm and close, if my parents had shown genuine interest in and support for my own life choices, if there had been reciprocity and mutual respect underlying our family dynamics, I might have approached this request with enthusiasm rather than dread. But none of those conditions existed. The request for my participation felt less like an invitation to celebrate a joyful occasion, and more like a demand for compliance with appearance maintenance. A requirement that I play my assigned role in the family narrative regardless of my actual feelings or relationship with the people involved. I was being asked to spend money. I did not have to participate in activities with people who had consistently demonstrated that they neither understood nor valued the life I had built for myself. I was being asked to use limited vacation time not for rest or personal enrichment, but to fulfill family obligations that benefited everyone except me. I was being asked to pretend that our relationships were closer and healthier than they actually were, to enable the fiction that we were a functional family celebrating together rather than a collection of people bound by biology but divided by fundamental incompatibility in values and priorities. By the time I reached my apartment building and climbed the 4 flights of stairs to my unit, my decision had crystallized with unexpected clarity. I would not be participating in Vanessa's wedding as a bridesmaid. I would not be spending $2,000. I did not have to stand beside someone who had shown me nothing but dismissal and condescension for years. I would not be enabling the family fiction that we had the kind of relationship that warranted this level of involvement in each other's lives. I would attend the ceremony as a guest if I chose to attend at all, but I would not be manipulated into a level of participation that served everyone's needs except my own. The question was not whether I would decline but how I would communicate that decision in a way that was clear and firm without being unnecessarily provocative or cruel. I sat at my small kitchen table with my laptop open in front of me, the document review entirely forgotten now, and began drafting an email to my mother. I revised it 7 times before finally achieving language that felt appropriately calibrated, respectful in tone but unambiguous in meaning, acknowledging the invitation while declining firmly without extensive justification that could be picked apart or used as fodder for negotiation. I explained that I appreciated being considered for the wedding party, but that I would need to respectfully decline due to work commitments and financial constraints that made the required participation infeasible at this time. I noted that I wished Vanessa happiness and would be glad to celebrate with the family in a less involved capacity. I thanked my mother for understanding and suggested that Vanessa would likely prefer to have someone stand up with her, who had a closer day-to-day relationship with her anyway, that the wedding party should reflect her actual friendships rather than being constructed primarily to satisfy family expectations about sibling involvement. I read the email one final time, my finger hovering over the send button, while my heart rate accelerated with anticipation of the response this would generate. Then I clicked send before I could second-guess myself further, watching the email disappear from my outbox and into the digital void where it would arrive in my mother's inbox within seconds. The relief was immediate and profound, physical tension releasing from my shoulders as though I had been carrying weight I had not fully recognized until it was gone. I had drawn a boundary, stated a limit, prioritized my own needs over family expectations for perhaps the first time in my adult life. The response arrived 18 minutes later, far too quickly for my mother to have processed the information and formulated a measured reaction. The email was brief and cold, informing me that Vanessa would be deeply hurt by this rejection, that my father was disappointed in my selfishness, that this decision would have consequences for my relationship with the family going forward, that I should not expect them to go out of their way to include me in future events when I had made my priorities so abundantly clear. The email concluded with a statement that managed to be simultaneously guilt-inducing and threatening. Family meant showing up for each other, and if I could not understand that basic principle, then perhaps I had become exactly the kind of person Vanessa had suggested 3 years ago, someone so consumed by career ambition that she had lost sight of what truly mattered in life. I read the email twice, feeling the familiar mixture of hurt and anger that interactions with my parents reliably generated, then closed my laptop without responding. There would be time to address this further, to weather whatever additional pressure would inevitably follow, to deal with the family drama that would now consume the next several weeks. For tonight, I had document review to complete, a case to prepare, work responsibilities that would not disappear simply because my personal life had become complicated. I poured a glass of wine, retrieved my laptop, and returned to analyzing email chains and technical specifications, grateful for work that demanded enough focus to temporarily crowd out emotional processing. The autumn night deepened outside my windows while I worked, the sounds of the city gradually quieting as evening transitioned toward night, and the neighborhood settled into its typical rhythms. Somewhere across the city, my family was undoubtedly discussing my refusal, characterizing it in ways that would fit their existing narrative about who I was and what I valued. But in my small apartment with my case files and my carefully constructed professional life, I felt unexpectedly at peace with the choice I had made. For once, I had chosen myself over family obligation, and whatever consequences followed would be faced from a position of integrity rather than resentful compliance. I did not yet know that this seemingly isolated conflict over wedding participation would become the catalyst for events that would eventually place all of us in a courtroom 3 months later, with a judge looking between me and my parents with an expression of stunned disbelief. I did not yet know that standing firm on this boundary would trigger a cascade of revelations and confrontations that would expose truths about my family that I had spent years avoiding acknowledging directly. I did not yet know that my decision on this ordinary Thursday evening would ultimately lead to the most transformative and difficult period of my entire adult life. A period that would test everything I believed about family loyalty, personal integrity, and what I was willing to tolerate in exchange for maintaining relationships with people who shared my DNA but little else. All of that was still ahead, hidden in a future I could not yet imagine. For now there was only this moment. A choice made, a boundary established, and the quiet satisfaction of having finally prioritized my own needs over expectations that had never served me. The document review continued late into the night, but I worked with unusual focus, energized rather than depleted by the decision I had made, feeling more like myself than I had in years. The response from my family arrived not through additional emails, but through a calculated silence that stretched across the following 48 hours like a tactical weapon designed to provoke anxiety and capitulation. Friday passed without any communication whatsoever, a notable absence given that my mother typically sent at least 3 or 4 text messages throughout any given week with links to articles she thought I should read, questions about my schedule, or observations about neighbors and acquaintances that she felt compelled to share. Saturday brought the same deliberate quiet, a void where normal family interaction should have existed, and I recognized the strategy for exactly what it was. An attempt to create enough discomfort through withdrawal that I would reach out first, apologizing and reversing my decision to avoid the emotional consequences of family displeasure. I had seen this pattern before, most notably when I had chosen the University of Washington for law school over Seattle University, where my parents had wanted me to attend because it was closer to home, and because my father had developed a friendship with someone on the admissions committee who could potentially advocate for scholarship consideration. My decision to attend UW, based on the school's superior reputation in intellectual property law, and its stronger connections to the technology sector where I intended to build my career, had been met with 3 weeks of minimal communication punctuated by pointed comments about how I apparently valued prestige over family preferences, how I was becoming increasingly distant and difficult to connect with, how my choices consistently prioritized my own ambitions over maintaining close family relationships. The silence had eventually broken when I had refused to apologize or second-guess my decision, at which point my parents had grudgingly accepted the situation, while maintaining an undercurrent of disappointment that colored our interactions for months afterward. I had learned from that experience that capitulating to their pressure tactics only reinforced the effectiveness of those strategies, teaching them that withdrawal and disapproval could reliably manipulate me into compliance. This time, I was determined to hold my position regardless of how uncomfortable the silence became, or how much pressure eventually followed, when they realized that I would not be making the first conciliatory move. Sunday afternoon brought the escalation I had been anticipating. My phone rang at 2:30 while I was at a coffee shop in my neighborhood, attempting to enjoy a rare afternoon away from work obligations by reading a novel that had been sitting on my shelf for 6 months. My father's name appeared on the screen, and I felt my stomach clench with that familiar combination of obligation and dread that accompanied most interactions with him. Where my mother's communication style tended toward emotional appeals and guilt-inducing narratives about family loyalty and mutual obligation, my father favored a more direct approach characterized by logical arguments about practicality and reasonable behavior, often delivered with an undertone of disappointment that managed to be simultaneously subtle and devastating. I answered the call and immediately recognized the tone he was employing, a particular quality of forced patience that suggested he was doing me the favor of explaining something obvious that I should have understood without requiring his intervention. He began by acknowledging that he understood I was busy with work, that he recognized my career demanded significant time and energy, that he appreciated how hard I worked to establish myself professionally in a competitive field. These preliminary acknowledgments felt like the foundation being laid for an argument that would ultimately conclude that despite all of these legitimate considerations, I was still fundamentally wrong in my decision regarding Vanessa's wedding. The argument, when it arrived, followed precisely the trajectory I had anticipated. He explained that family weddings were important milestones that required setting aside personal preferences and inconveniences to demonstrate unity and support. He noted that the financial investment, while significant, was temporary and manageable if I simply adjusted my budget for a few months and perhaps reduced discretionary spending in other areas. He suggested that my reluctance to participate stemmed from lingering resentment about past disagreements with Vanessa, conflicts that he characterized as typical sibling rivalry that mature adults should be capable of moving beyond for the sake of family harmony. His conclusion arrived wrapped in language about expectations and responsibility. As the eldest daughter, he informed me with that particular tone of disappointed authority, I had certain obligations to model appropriate family behavior and to support my younger sister during significant life events. My refusal to participate as requested was not simply a personal choice, but a failure to fulfill basic family duties that came with my position in the family structure. He did not explicitly threaten consequences, but the implication hung in the carefully chosen words and measured pauses. This decision would be remembered, would influence how I was perceived within the family going forward, would determine whether I could expect support from them when I eventually needed it for my own life milestones. I listened to the entire monologue without interrupting, a strategy one had learned from years of courtroom observation where allowing opposing counsel to fully articulate their position often revealed weaknesses and assumptions that could be systematically addressed in response. When my father finally paused, clearly expecting either capitulation or defensive justification, I took a slow breath and delivered the response I had been mentally preparing since sending that initial email to my mother 2 days earlier. I thanked him for sharing his perspective and acknowledged that I understood the family's disappointment with my decision. I then explained, with the same measured tone I employed when presenting arguments to judges who were skeptical of my client's position, that my choice was not based on temporary inconvenience or unresolved sibling conflict, but on a fundamental assessment of my relationship with Vanessa and my capacity to participate meaningfully in an event that required substantial financial and emotional investment. I noted that authenticity in family relationships mattered more than maintaining appearances, that participating as a bridesmaid when our actual relationship did not warrant that level of involvement would be dishonest and ultimately disrespectful to everyone involved. I addressed the financial argument directly, explaining that characterizing $2,000 as easily manageable through minor budget adjustments demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of my actual financial situation. My student loan debt, which exceeded $180,000 when accounting for accumulated interest, required monthly payments that consumed a significant portion of my income. My rent, my professional expenses, my basic cost of living in one of the most expensive cities in the country left minimal discretionary income, even before considering additional obligations. The suggestion that I could simply reduce spending in other areas ignored the reality that I was already living on a carefully managed budget that allowed for virtually no flexibility without compromising either debt repayment or basic necessities. Regarding the characterization of my relationship with Vanessa as typical sibling rivalry that mature adults should move beyond, I suggested gently but firmly that this framing minimized legitimate differences in how we had been treated throughout our lives and the impact those patterns had on our current dynamic. I noted that moving beyond past conflicts required acknowledgement and mutual effort, rather than simply expecting one party to absorb hurt feelings and pretend that concerning patterns had never existed. I expressed that I wished Vanessa happiness in her marriage and held no ill will toward her, but that wishing someone well did not automatically translate into obligation to participate in their celebrations at significant personal cost. The silence that followed my response stretched long enough that I wondered whether the call had dropped. Then my father's voice returned, noticeably harder than it had been moments earlier, the veneer of patient reasoning stripped away to reveal anger beneath. He informed me that I was being selfish and short-sighted, that I was prioritizing money over family in a way that reflected poorly on my character and values, that my mother was deeply hurt by my attitude, and that Vanessa was devastated by what she perceived as a rejection of such magnitude that it called into question whether we had any meaningful relationship at all. He concluded with a statement that felt like a door closing, heavy and final. If this was truly my decision, if I was genuinely unwilling to reconsider and do what was right for the family, then I should not expect them to go out of their way to include me in future family activities or to provide support when I eventually needed it. He suggested that perhaps some distance would be beneficial for everyone, that maybe I needed time to reflect on my priorities and what truly mattered in life, that when I was ready to apologize and repair the damage I had caused, they might be willing to discuss reconciliation. Until then, he saw no point in continuing to argue about a decision I had apparently already made without regard for anyone's feelings but my own. The call ended abruptly, my father disconnecting before I could formulate any response to this ultimatum. I sat in the coffee shop with my phone still pressed to my ear, the novel forgotten on the table in front of me, processing the conversation that had just occurred and the implications of what had been said. The threat had been delivered clearly despite the diplomatic language. Comply with family expectations or accept exile from family inclusion and support. The choice was being framed as mine, but the options had been constructed to ensure that only one could be considered acceptable within their framework of what family loyalty required. Part of me felt the expected rush of guilt and anxiety, the conditioned response to parental disapproval that had been instilled through decades of similar interactions. The voice in my head that sounded suspiciously like my mother asked whether I was really willing to damage family relationships over money, whether my pride was worth the cost of alienating the people who had raised me, whether I would regret this inflexibility when I was older and recognized how few opportunities existed to celebrate major milestones with family members. That voice suggested that perhaps I was being unreasonable, that perhaps the mature response would be to set aside my hurt feelings and participate as requested, that perhaps maintaining family harmony was worth the financial sacrifice and emotional discomfort. But another voice, one that had been growing stronger over the past several years as I had established my independence and built a life separate from my family's influence, recognized this moment for what it truly represented. This was not actually about whether I attended Vanessa's wedding as a bridesmaid or as a regular guest. This was about whether I would continue to accept a pattern where my needs, my feelings, my financial limitations, and my perspective on our relationships were consistently subordinated to everyone else's preferences and expectations. This was about whether I would allow guilt and obligation to override my assessment of what was healthy and sustainable for me, whether I would continue to sacrifice my own well-being to maintain a version of family harmony that primarily benefited everyone except me. I left the coffee shop and walked through my neighborhood without any particular destination, needing movement and air to process the weight of what had just occurred. The autumn afternoon was beautiful in that particular way that Seattle specializes in during September and early October, the light golden and warm, the air crisp enough to require a light jacket but not yet carrying the heavy dampness that would characterize the approaching winter months. Families walked past me with children on bicycles, couples held hands while walking dogs, individuals jogged past with focused expressions and measured breathing. All around me, people were living their ordinary lives, navigating their own challenges and relationships, unaware of the small personal crisis unfolding in my internal landscape. By the time I returned to my apartment an hour later, my decision had solidified further rather than softening under the weight of my father's ultimatum. I would not be apologizing. I would not be reconsidering my position regarding the wedding. I would not be accepting the premise that maintaining family relationships required consistently subordinating my own needs and boundaries to everyone else's preferences. If my family chose to respond to my boundary by withdrawing their inclusion and support, that outcome would be unfortunate, but ultimately revealed truths about the conditional nature of their affection that I needed to acknowledge, rather than continuing to ignore. Monday arrived with the responsibilities and demands of my professional life, providing welcome distraction from family drama. I threw myself into work with unusual focus, grateful for cases that required analytical thinking and strategic planning, rather than emotional processing. The software trade secrets case had entered a new phase requiring preparation for depositions of key witnesses, and I spent the day drafting questions designed to establish timeline and knowledge elements that would be crucial for our defense strategy. The intellectual challenge engaged parts of my brain that family conflict could not access, providing respite through the simple clarity of legal issues that had right and wrong answers, rather than the murky territory of relational dynamics where rightness depended entirely on whose perspective held priority. Sandra, my paralegal, noticed my unusual intensity and asked during our afternoon meeting whether everything was all right. I appreciated her concern while deflecting the specifics, offering only that I was dealing with some family complications that were occupying more mental energy than I would prefer. She nodded with understanding that suggested personal familiarity with difficult family dynamics, then shared that she had not spoken to her own sister in 5 years following a conflict over their mother's care that had exposed fundamental differences in values and priorities. The disclosure surprised me given Sandra's typically professional demeanor and her general reluctance to share personal information beyond surface-level details about her daughters and husband. She explained briefly that the estrangement had been painful initially, but had ultimately provided relief from a relationship that had been consistently draining and one-sided for decades. She noted that not all family relationships were worth preserving at any cost, that sometimes the healthiest choice involved accepting that biological connection did not automatically translate into emotional compatibility or mutual respect, that it was possible to wish family members well from a distance without maintaining close involvement in their lives. Her perspective offered validation I had not realized I needed, confirmation from someone I respected that boundary setting with family was not inherently selfish or immature, but could represent appropriate self-protection and honest acknowledgement of relationship realities. Tuesday brought the next escalation in the form of a text message from Vanessa herself, the first direct communication we had shared in months. The message arrived during my lunch break while I was reviewing documents at my desk, having skipped the usual midday walk in favor of making progress on case preparation. The text was long, filling my phone screen with multiple paragraphs that I had to scroll through repeatedly to fully absorb. Vanessa began by expressing hurt and confusion about my refusal to participate in her wedding, characterizing my decision as a rejection of such profound magnitude that she was struggling to understand what she had done to deserve this treatment from her own sister. She acknowledged that we had grown apart over the years, and that we did not share the same priorities or lifestyle choices, but suggested that these differences should not prevent me from setting them aside for one day to celebrate what was supposed to be the happiest occasion of her life. She noted that she had always looked up to me as her older sister, that she had admired my academic achievements and career success even if she did not fully understand the choices I had made, that my absence from her wedding party felt like a statement that she did not matter to me at all. The message continued with details about how my refusal had created complications for wedding planning, forcing her to rethink the symmetry of the wedding party, and to explain to Derek's family why her own sister would not be standing up with her during the ceremony. She described the embarrassment of having to acknowledge family conflict to people she was trying to impress, the stress of dealing with our parents' disappointment and anger, the additional emotional burden being placed on what was already an overwhelming process of planning a major life event. She concluded by asking directly whether there was anything she could do to change my mind, whether we could talk through whatever issues had created this situation, whether I would reconsider if she adjusted some of the expectations around cost or time commitment. I read the message 3 times, analyzing the language and subtext with the same attention I would apply to reviewing a contract for ambiguous terms or hidden obligations. The hurt Vanessa expressed might have been genuine, but the framing revealed assumptions that I found troubling. Her characterization of our relationship suggested that she perceived us as closer than we actually were, that she had somehow remained unaware of the distance that had grown between us over years of minimal meaningful interaction. Her request for me to set aside our differences for one day ignored that my decision was not about differences in lifestyle or priorities, but about the fundamental question of whether participating authentically was possible given the actual state of our relationship. The mention of embarrassment and complications created by my refusal particularly struck me as revealing. Vanessa's concern seemed focused primarily on how my absence would be perceived by others rather than on any genuine desire for my presence based on valuing our relationship. She was worried about explaining my absence to Derek's family, about maintaining the appearance of family unity and closeness, about ensuring that nothing disrupted the perfect aesthetic and narrative she had constructed for her wedding day. My actual presence or absence mattered less than what that presence or absence signaled to others about family dynamics and relationships. I drafted several potential responses over the course of the next hour, attempting to find language that was honest without being unnecessarily hurtful, that addressed her concerns without reopening negotiations about my decision. The final version acknowledged her disappointment and expressed understanding that my choice had created complications she had not anticipated. I explained that my decision was not based on any specific action she had taken, but on my honest assessment of our relationship and my capacity to participate meaningfully in her celebration given the financial and emotional investment required. I noted that I wished her happiness and would be glad to attend the ceremony as a guest if she wanted me there, but that I could not in good conscience commit to a level of involvement that our actual relationship did not support. I also addressed directly the issue of appearances and explanations to others. I suggested that honesty might serve her better than attempting to maintain fictions about family closeness, that she could simply explain that we had different perspectives on appropriate family involvement and had agreed to disagree respectfully. I noted that healthy families made space for different comfort levels and boundaries, rather than requiring uniformity in how relationships were expressed or celebrated. I concluded by reiterating that this was not about her personally but about me establishing limits that felt appropriate and sustainable given all the factors involved. Her response arrived within minutes, suggesting she had been waiting actively for my reply. The tone had shifted dramatically from hurt confusion to cold anger. She wrote that my response confirmed everything she had suspected about who I had become, that I was so consumed by career ambition and intellectual superiority that I had lost the capacity for normal human warmth and family connection. She suggested that my supposed boundaries were actually just selfishness dressed up in therapeutic language, that I was using psychology terminology to justify behavior that was simply cruel and rejecting. She concluded by stating that she no longer wanted me at the wedding at all, not as a bridesmaid and not as a guest, that my presence would only remind her of my rejection and would taint what should be a purely happy occasion. The finality of that statement should have brought relief or at least closure, but instead it triggered a complicated mixture of emotions that I struggled to untangle while sitting at my desk surrounded by case files and legal documents. Part of me felt vindicated, confirmed in my assessment that participating in this wedding would have been disingenuous given the actual state of our relationship. Part of me felt hurt by the characterization of my choices as evidence of losing my humanity, by the suggestion that career success and clear boundaries were inherently incompatible with warmth and connection. Part of me felt a grief that surprised me with its intensity, mourning not the specific loss of attending this particular wedding, but the broader recognition that whatever sisterly relationship I had imagined we might someday rebuild was probably lost permanently now. I did not respond to Vanessa's final message. There seemed to be nothing productive to say. No combination of words that would bridge the fundamental gap in how we understood family obligation and authentic relationship. The conversation had reached its natural conclusion with both of us having stated our positions clearly, and neither finding common ground for compromise or mutual understanding. The silence that followed felt different from my parents' calculated withdrawal, less like a tactical maneuver and more like an honest acknowledgement that we had nothing more to say to each other that would improve the situation. Wednesday brought unexpected complications in the form of an email from my Aunt Diane, my mother's younger sister, who lived in Spokane and whom I saw perhaps twice per year at major family gatherings. The email opened with casual pleasantries before transitioning into its actual purpose. She had heard from my mother about the situation with Vanessa's wedding, and wanted to offer her perspective as someone outside the immediate conflict who cared about everyone involved. The tone aimed for neutral mediation, presenting herself as a reasonable voice who could help all parties see past their immediate emotions to find resolution that would serve everyone's interests. Her argument, laid out across several paragraphs, essentially suggested that I was technically within my rights to decline participation, but that exercising those rights in this situation was unwise given the permanent damage being done to family relationships over what she characterized as ultimately a minor disagreement about wedding involvement. She acknowledged that the financial burden was significant, but suggested that family members often made sacrifices for each other during important events, that this was part of what being in a family meant, that I would likely regret letting money determine whether I participated in my sister's wedding when I looked back on this decision years from now. She concluded by gently encouraging me to reconsider, to perhaps reach out to Vanessa with an olive branch, to find some middle ground that would allow me to participate in a limited way that felt more comfortable, while still demonstrating family support and solidarity. The email represented exactly the kind of well-intentioned, but ultimately unhelpful intervention that characterized extended family involvement in conflicts they did not fully understand. Aunt Diane meant well, but her perspective was based entirely on information provided by my mother, a narrative that undoubtedly framed the situation in ways that minimized legitimate concerns I had raised while emphasizing my supposed inflexibility and selfishness. She did not know about years of patterns where my choices were criticized while Vanessa's were celebrated, where my boundaries were characterized as problematic while Vanessa's demands were accommodated without question, where my achievements were met with qualified approval while Vanessa's mediocrity was praised as evidence of being well-rounded and socially intelligent. I responded briefly, thanking her for her concern while explaining that the situation was more complicated than it might appear from outside, and that I had made my decision after careful consideration of multiple factors including but not limited to financial constraints. I noted that I appreciated her desire to help, but that this was ultimately between me and my immediate family to resolve or not resolve as circumstances developed. I kept the tone polite but firm, avoiding detailed explanations that would either be repeated back to my mother or require extensive background that I did not have the energy to provide. Thursday evening brought the development that would ultimately prove to be the true inciting incident for everything that followed, though I did not recognize its significance at the time. I received a certified letter at my apartment, requiring my signature for receipt, bearing the return address of a law firm I did not recognize. My hand shook slightly as I opened the envelope, my legal training immediately recognizing that certified mail from a law firm rarely contained good news for the recipient. Inside was a letter, printed on heavy letterhead, informing me that the firm represented my parents regarding a family matter requiring immediate attention and resolution. The letter stated that I was in possession of certain property that legally belonged to my parents, specifically jewelry and family heirlooms that had been given to me over the years with the understanding that these items were loans rather than gifts, intended to be returned to the family when requested or passed to other family members as my parents determined appropriate. The letter demanded that I return these items within 14 days or face legal action to recover the property along with damages for my continued possession of items that did not legally belong to me. I read the letter multiple times, my professional training warring with personal shock at what I was seeing. The items in question included a pearl necklace my grandmother had given me for my college graduation, a sapphire ring I had received for my 21st birthday, and several other pieces of jewelry I had worn regularly throughout my adult life. Some of these items had been in my possession for nearly a decade, given to me during celebrations with clear language about them being gifts to commemorate specific achievements or milestones. The suggestion that these had been loans rather than gifts was not only absurd from a legal standpoint, but revealed a level of vindictiveness I had not anticipated even given our current conflict. The implications were immediately clear. My parents were attempting to use legal pressure to punish me for refusing to comply with their demands regarding Vanessa's wedding. They were willing to misrepresent the nature of gifts given years earlier, to engage attorneys and initiate legal proceedings, to threaten me with damages and court action over a family conflict about wedding participation. The escalation was so extreme, so disproportionate to the underlying disagreement, that I initially questioned whether I was misunderstanding something fundamental about the situation. But the letter was clear in its demands and threats. I had 14 days to return property my parents claimed as theirs, or I would be sued for recovery of that property plus additional damages for what they characterized as my wrongful retention of items I knew did not belong to me. The letter concluded with contact information for the attorney, and a statement that all future communication about this matter should be directed through his office, rather than directly to my parents. I sat at my kitchen table with the letter in front of me, my mind racing through the legal implications while simultaneously trying to process the emotional reality of what was happening. My parents had escalated a disagreement about wedding participation into threatened litigation over property, employing legal mechanisms to create pressure and consequences for my refusal to comply with their expectations. The message was unmistakable. Fall in line with family demands or face increasingly severe consequences that would extend into legal and financial realms beyond simple family conflict. The choice before me was suddenly much larger than whether to attend a wedding or how to manage difficult family relationships. I was being forced to decide whether I would capitulate to threats and manipulation, or whether I would stand firm on boundaries, even when doing so meant engaging in legal conflict with my own parents. The comfortable middle ground I had been trying to maintain, where I could set reasonable limits while still preserving some version of family relationship, was being systematically eliminated by their escalating responses to my initial boundary. I spent that evening researching the attorney whose name appeared on the letter, discovering that he practiced primarily in estate planning and probate law rather than civil litigation, suggesting that my parents had approached him through personal connections rather than selecting someone with relevant expertise in property disputes. I reviewed my own records regarding the jewelry in question, locating photographs from the occasions when these items had been given to me, cards and notes that accompanied some of the gifts, and witnesses who had been present when certain pieces were presented to me explicitly as graduation or birthday presents rather than loans or temporary transfers. The legal case my parents were threatening to bring was weak to the point of frivolousness, something that any competent attorney should have recognized before sending a demand letter. The fact that they had found someone willing to put their name on this letter suggested either that the attorney was not particularly concerned with the merits of the claim, or that my parents had misrepresented the facts to him in ways that made their position seem more legitimate than it actually was. Either possibility was troubling, indicating a level of commitment to this escalation that went beyond empty threats into actual willingness to engage legal systems inappropriately to achieve desired outcomes. By the time I went to bed Thursday night, my course of action had clarified with absolute certainty. I would not be returning the jewelry. I would not be capitulating to threats based on false claims about property ownership. I would be responding to this demand letter through my own attorney, making clear that I understood my legal rights and would not be intimidated into compliance through inappropriate legal pressure. If my parents wanted to actually file a lawsuit over this matter, they were welcome to do so, and I would defend myself vigorously while documenting their misuse of legal systems for personal vendettas against family members who declined to submit to their control. The wedding conflict had transformed into something much more serious, much more revealing about the lengths my parents would go to enforce compliance with their expectations. The boundaries I had attempted to establish were being met not with grudging acceptance or even angry rejection, but with systematic escalation designed to make the cost of maintaining those boundaries prohibitively high. I had reached a point where retreat was no longer possible without completely abandoning any pretense of self-respect or autonomy, where the only viable path forward required standing firm regardless of the consequences that continued to unfold. Friday morning arrived with the kind of gray Seattle drizzle that matched my internal state perfectly, rain streaking down my apartment windows while I sat at my kitchen table with coffee growing cold in front of me, and the demand letter from my parents' attorney spread out like evidence of a crime I was still trying to fully comprehend. I had barely slept the previous night, my mind cycling repeatedly through the implications of what my parents had done, the calculated nature of their escalation, and the stark reality that the family I had been trying to preserve some connection with was willing to weaponize legal systems against me for the offense of establishing boundaries around my own time and resources. The emotional weight of this revelation pressed down with a heaviness that felt almost physical, settling into my chest and making each breath require conscious effort. This was not simply anger at being treated unfairly or hurt at being misunderstood. This was something more fundamental and more devastating. The shattering of whatever remaining illusions I had maintained about the basic nature of my relationship with my parents. I had known for years that our dynamic was troubled, that they favored Vanessa in ways that were obvious and hurtful, that they struggled to understand or value the choices I had made in building my career and my independent life. I had rationalized these patterns as typical family complications, the kind of imperfect relationships that most people navigated with varying degrees of success and frustration. But threatening legal action over fabricated property claims crossed a line that transformed understanding into something darker and more painful. This was not parental disappointment or even garden-variety favoritism. This was vindictive retaliation designed to punish me for noncompliance, a deliberate attempt to create consequences severe enough that I would learn never to refuse their demands again. The fact that they were willing to lie about the nature of gifts given years earlier, to involve attorneys and legal systems, to potentially drag me into court proceedings over jewelry that everyone involved knew had been given to me as presents rather than loans, revealed a capacity for cruelty that I had not fully acknowledged even during our most difficult interactions over the years. I thought back through my history with these pieces of jewelry, each item connected to specific memories that now took on new and painful significance. The pearl necklace from my grandmother had been presented to me at my college graduation party, given directly into my hands by Grandma Ruth with explicit language about how proud she was of my achievements, and how she wanted me to have something beautiful to wear as I entered the professional world. My mother had been standing right there during that exchange, had smiled and commented on how lovely the necklace would look with the professional wardrobe I would need for job interviews and eventual employment. There had been absolutely no suggestion at that moment or any time in the subsequent 9 years that this gift was anything other than permanent transfer of property from grandmother to granddaughter. The sapphire ring had been a 21st birthday present from my parents themselves, given to me at a family dinner where they had made a small speech about me becoming a full adult and deserving something special to mark the occasion. My father had specifically said that he hoped I would wear it often and think of them, that it was a symbol of their pride in the young woman I was becoming. Vanessa had been there for that dinner, had looked at the ring with what I had interpreted at the time as envy, but which I now wondered might have been something else entirely. Had my parents already been planning even then to reclaim gifts if I ever stepped too far out of line? If I ever prioritized my own needs over their expectations in ways they found intolerable? The other pieces mentioned in the demand letter carried similar histories. A bracelet given for passing the bar exam, earrings presented at law school graduation, a brooch that had belonged to my great-grandmother and had been given to me with explicit discussion about family heritage being passed down to the next generation. Every single item had been presented as a gift during moments of celebration, with witnesses present and clear language about permanence and pride and connection. The suggestion now that these had been loans or conditional transfers was not simply legally absurd, but emotionally devastating in its revisionist rewriting of what those moments had meant. I found myself questioning everything I remembered about my family history, wondering what other interactions I had misunderstood or misinterpreted, what other apparently positive moments had actually carried hidden conditions or unspoken expectations that I had failed to recognize. If gifts given during celebrations with explicit language about pride and achievement could be retroactively reframed as loans subject to recall, what else in my understanding of family relationships was built on foundations that could be dissolved or rewritten when convenient for their narrative? The sense of unreality was profound, as though I had discovered that my entire personal history existed in two completely different versions depending on whose perspective held priority. The professional part of my brain, the attorney who had spent years learning to analyze situations objectively and identify the strongest arguments and weaknesses in any position, recognized immediately that this demand letter represented both a threat and an opportunity. The threat was obvious. My parents were willing to use legal systems to harass and punish me, to create costs and stress and public conflict that would pressure me into capitulation. But the opportunity was equally significant. They had created documentation of their vindictiveness, evidence of their willingness to make false claims and misuse legal processes, a paper trail that would be extremely useful if this situation continued to escalate in ways that required me to defend myself more formally. I spent Friday morning drafting a detailed response to my parents' attorney, working from my apartment rather than going into the office because I could not imagine focusing on client matters while this personal crisis demanded attention. My response laid out with legal precision the history of each piece of jewelry mentioned in the demand letter, including dates when items were received, the occasions being celebrated, the specific language used when gifts were presented, and the witnesses who were present for these exchanges. I attached photographs showing me wearing these items at various points over the years, demonstrating continuous possession and use consistent with ownership rather than borrowing or temporary custody. I addressed directly the legal standards for distinguishing gifts from loans, explaining that the burden of proof rested on anyone claiming that an apparent gift was actually a loan or conditional transfer, that this burden required clear and convincing evidence of contrary intent at the time of transfer, and that retroactive recharacterization of completed gifts, based on subsequent relationship conflicts, was not legally supportable. I noted that the items in question had been in my possession for periods ranging from 3 to 9 years, that I had treated them consistently as my own property during that entire time, and that no one had ever suggested any limitation on my ownership until this current family disagreement had created motivation to fabricate such claims. I concluded by stating clearly that I would not be returning any of the jewelry, that I understood my legal rights regarding property I had received as gifts, and that if my parents wished to pursue this matter through litigation, I would defend myself vigorously while also considering whether their false claims constituted grounds for counterclaims including abuse of process or malicious prosecution depending on how the situation developed. I kept the tone professional and measured throughout, avoiding emotional language or personal attacks, presenting myself as someone who understood legal systems and would not be intimidated by threats based on claims that lacked merit. Before sending the response, I called my own attorney, a woman named Rebecca Chun who had helped me with the purchase of my car 2 years earlier, and who practiced in civil litigation with experience in property disputes. I explained the situation concisely, sent her copies of both the demand letter and my draft response, and asked whether she would be willing to represent me if this matter escalated beyond correspondence into actual litigation. Rebecca asked several clarifying questions about the history of the items and the current family conflict, then delivered her assessment with characteristic directness. The legal claims being made by my parents were frivolous to the point that the attorney who had sent the demand letter was likely operating based on incomplete or false information provided by his clients rather than on any independent assessment of the merits. Rebecca explained that if the situation proceeded to actual litigation, my parents would be unlikely to find competent counsel willing to pursue such weak claims, but that desperation or vindictiveness sometimes motivated people to proceed with legal action, even when they had little chance of success. She agreed to represent me if necessary, suggested sending my response letter through her office to establish attorney representation clearly, and recommended that I begin documenting all interactions with my family going forward in case this pattern of escalation continued. Her perspective provided both reassurance about the legal weakness of my parents' position and validation that my assessment of their behavior as extreme and vindictive was not simply emotional overreaction, but accurate characterization of conduct that fell outside normal family conflict parameters. Rebecca noted that she had seen similar patterns in estate disputes where family members attempted to use legal systems to punish relatives who had disappointed them or failed to comply with expectations, but that such tactics typically backfired when subjected to actual judicial scrutiny. She encouraged me to stand firm, to refuse any compromise that would reward threatening behavior, and to trust that legal processes would ultimately protect legitimate property rights against fabricated claims designed purely for harassment purposes. The response letter went out Friday afternoon through Rebecca's office, transforming what my parents had probably intended as an intimidating threat into a formal legal correspondence that established my representation and made clear that I understood my rights and would not be manipulated through baseless legal pressure. The act of sending that letter felt simultaneously empowering and terrifying, a point of no return that eliminated whatever remaining possibility existed for de-escalation or reconciliation. I was no longer simply the daughter who had declined to participate in a wedding, but had become an adverse party in potential litigation, someone who had rejected not just their demands but their authority to make demands backed by legal threats. That evening I did something I had avoided doing for years despite occasional impulses to seek outside perspective. I called my grandmother Ruth, the woman who had given me the pearl necklace that was now being claimed as my parents' property subject to recall. Grandma Ruth was 83 years old, living independently in a retirement community in Olympia where she maintained an active social life, and continued to travel internationally despite my parents' repeated suggestions that she should slow down and stay closer to family. She had always been the family member I felt most understood me, the person who asked about my work with genuine interest rather than veiled criticism, who celebrated my achievements without qualification or comparison to Vanessa's different choices. I had hesitated to involve her in this conflict partly out of desire to protect her from family drama, and partly out of uncertainty about whether she would support my position or encourage me to compromise for the sake of family harmony in whatever time she had remaining with all of us. But the demand letter had mentioned her necklace specifically, had attempted to claim as my parents' property an item she had given me directly with clear intent that it belonged to me permanently. She deserved to know that her gift was being characterized as something other than what she had intended, and I needed to hear from someone who had witnessed that original transfer what she remembered about the circumstances and language used. Grandma Ruth answered on the third ring, her voice carrying the slight tremor that had developed over the past few years but still recognizably strong and clear. We exchanged initial pleasantries about her activities and my work before I transitioned into explaining why I was calling, laying out the entire situation from the initial wedding conflict through my refusal to participate through the demand letter that had arrived the previous day. I spoke carefully, trying to present facts without excessive emotional coloring, giving her space to form her own assessment rather than simply seeking validation for positions I had already taken. The silence that followed my explanation stretched long enough that I began to worry the call had dropped, or that she was struggling to process information that revealed her own children in an unflattering light that might be difficult to accept. Then she spoke, her voice suddenly much stronger and clearer than it had been moments earlier, carrying a quality of controlled fury that I had rarely heard from her. She told me that the pearl necklace had absolutely been given to me as a permanent gift, that she remembered that graduation party clearly, and had specifically chosen to give me that particular necklace because it had been worn by her own mother, and represented a family tradition of passing items down to granddaughters who had demonstrated independence and achievement. She noted that my mother had been present for that exchange and had never suggested any limitation or condition on the transfer, that the idea of claiming it as retrievable property was not only legally absurd but personally insulting to her as the person who had made the original gift. Grandma Ruth continued with revelations that reframed much of what I thought I understood about family dynamics. She explained that she had become increasingly concerned over the past decade about how my parents treated me compared to Vanessa, how they seemed to struggle with having a daughter who chose career and independence over more traditional paths, how they appeared to take my achievements for granted while celebrating Vanessa's mediocrity as though it were exceptional. She had tried to address these patterns with my mother on several occasions, pointing out that different children had different strengths and that both daughters deserved equal support and celebration. But her concerns had been dismissed as misunderstanding or as generational differences in how parents approached relationships with adult children. She revealed something I had never known. When she had made her will several years earlier, she had specifically designated certain items to pass to me directly rather than going through my parents, precisely because she worried that they might not honor her intentions about who should receive family heirlooms. The pearl necklace had been meant to be the first of several items that would eventually come to me, but she had given it early because she wanted to see me wear it and enjoy it rather than waiting until she was gone. The fact that my parents were now trying to claim it as their own property validated her concerns, and made her question whether other provisions in her will might need to be revised to prevent similar interference with her intended distributions. This information landed with the force of confirmation I had not realized I desperately needed. The patterns I had observed and experienced were not simply my perception or my sensitivity, but were obvious enough that someone outside the immediate parent-child dynamic had noticed them and felt concerned enough to take proactive steps to protect me. Grandma Ruth's perspective carried weight both because of her position in the family and because of her general reputation for fairness and clear-sightedness about human behavior. If she characterized my parents' treatment of me as problematic and their current actions as vindictive, then I could trust my own assessment rather than continuing to question whether I was being unreasonable or oversensitive. We talked for nearly an hour, Grandma Ruth sharing observations from years of family gatherings and interactions that took on new significance in light of current events. She noted that my mother had always seemed uncomfortable with having a daughter who excelled academically and professionally in ways that exceeded her own achievements, that there appeared to be some level of jealousy or resentment beneath the surface criticism that my mother framed as concern or disappointment. She observed that my father enabled this dynamic by consistently siding with my mother, even when her positions were obviously unfair, that he seemed to value peace in his marriage over justice or fairness in how his daughters were treated. Regarding Vanessa, Grandma Ruth offered a perspective that was simultaneously compassionate and clear-eyed. She suggested that Vanessa had been damaged by being the favored child in ways that were perhaps less visible but equally problematic as the damage done to me by being consistently undervalued. Vanessa had never been required to develop genuine competence or independence, had never faced consequences for poor decisions or lack of follow-through, had been so consistently praised for minimal effort that she had never learned to push herself toward real achievement. The upcoming marriage to Derek might seem like success from one angle, but Grandma Ruth expressed concern that Vanessa was marrying primarily for financial security and status rather than genuine partnership, that she was following a script provided by our parents rather than making authentic choices based on self-knowledge and mature judgment. This nuanced perspective helped me see the family system more completely, understanding that while my role as the undervalued daughter had been painful and limiting, Vanessa's role as the golden child had been ultimately just as constraining, even if more superficially pleasant. We were both trapped in positions assigned by our parents' needs and neuroses rather than being seen and supported as the individuals we actually were. The difference was that my assigned role had become increasingly uncomfortable as I developed independence and agency, forcing confrontation with the system's dysfunction, while Vanessa's role remained comfortable enough that she had little motivation to question or challenge the underlying dynamics. Before ending our conversation, Grandma Ruth made me promise to keep her informed about how the situation developed, and to call her immediately if my parents continued to escalate, or if I needed any form of support, whether financial, emotional, or practical. She stated clearly that she supported my decision to establish boundaries, that she was proud of me for refusing to be manipulated through threats, and that she would be willing to provide testimony or written statements about the gift history if the situation proceeded to litigation. She also mentioned that she would be having a serious conversation with my mother about the inappropriateness of attempting to reclaim gifts and the damage being done to family relationships through these vindictive tactics. I ended the call feeling simultaneously validated and heartbroken, confirmed in my assessment of the situation, but also forced to fully acknowledge truths about my family that I had spent years trying to minimize or explain away. The conversation with Grandma Ruth had removed my ability to maintain comfortable illusions about family dynamics being simply complicated or imperfect. The patterns were clear, the favoritism was obvious, the damage was real, and the current escalation was entirely consistent with decades of behavior that had always privileged family image and parental control over individual autonomy or equitable treatment. Saturday morning brought a text message from my mother, the first direct communication from her since the demand letter had been sent. The message ignored the legal escalation entirely, instead focusing on Vanessa's wedding and the upcoming timeline. She wrote that final RSVPs were due to the venue by the following Friday, that they needed to know whether I would be attending as a regular guest since I had declined to participate as a bridesmaid, that Vanessa wanted to finalize seating arrangements and needed to account for my presence or absence. The tone aimed for casual normalcy, as though we had not crossed into territory of threatened litigation, as though the demand for return of jewelry had been a separate matter entirely unrelated to family gathering plans. The cognitive dissonance was remarkable. The ability to operate simultaneously in two completely contradictory frameworks where legal threats and family event planning existed in parallel universes that never acknowledged each other. I recognized this as another manipulation tactic, an attempt to establish that our relationship could continue normally in some domains while legal conflict proceeded in others, that I could be threatened with lawsuits while still being expected to fulfill family obligations and maintain appearances at celebrations. The underlying message was that resistance would be costly and uncomfortable, while compliance would allow return to familiar if imperfect family patterns, that I could choose between ongoing conflict and eventual exhaustion or capitulation and peace. I did not respond to my mother's text immediately, instead spending Saturday morning on a long walk through my neighborhood and adjacent areas. Needing physical movement to process the layers of manipulation and dysfunction I was being forced to confront directly. The autumn morning was crisp and clear, the rain from the previous day having given way to brilliant sunshine that made the remaining leaves glow gold and orange against deep blue sky. Families were out enjoying the weather, children riding bicycles with training wheels while parents walked behind with encouraging words and watchful eyes, couples walked dogs and held coffee cups and planned their weekend errands. I observed these ordinary scenes of functional family life and felt the sharp contrast with my own situation, the recognition that whatever I had thought family meant or should mean bore little resemblance to the reality of my relationships with the people who shared my biology and history. There would be no peaceful weekend planning, no comfortable collaboration on shared projects, no foundation of mutual respect and care that allowed for disagreement without dissolution. Instead, there were ultimatums and threats, legal harassment and emotional manipulation, a systematic campaign to force compliance through escalating pressure, rather than any genuine effort to understand my perspective or respect my autonomy. By the time I returned to my apartment that afternoon, my decision about the wedding RSVP had crystallized clearly. I would not be attending Vanessa's wedding in any capacity, not as a bridesmaid and not as a guest. My presence would be dishonest given the current state of our relationships, would require me to pretend that nothing significant had occurred, would enable my family to maintain their preferred narrative that we were simply working through minor disagreements rather than facing fundamental incompatibility in values and relational patterns. I would not provide them with the satisfaction of my attendance as evidence that their manipulation tactics had succeeded in controlling my behavior even if they had not achieved their primary objective of forcing me into the wedding party. I composed a brief text message response to my mother stating simply that I would not be attending the wedding, and that she should plan accordingly. I did not provide justification or explanation, did not reference the demand letter or the broader conflict, offered no opening for negotiation or discussion. The message was a simple statement of fact, a boundary clearly established without invitation for debate. I sent it before I could second-guess the decision, then silenced my phone to avoid the immediate response I knew would arrive within minutes. The emotional impact of these accumulated revelations and decisions settled over me throughout that weekend with a heaviness that felt almost like grief. A mourning for relationships that I now recognized had never actually existed in the form I had imagined them. I was grieving not the loss of current family connections, but the death of hope that those connections might someday transform into something healthy and mutual, that with enough patience or maturity or distance the underlying dynamics might shift toward equity and respect. The conversation with Grandma Ruth had made clear that the patterns were decades old and deeply entrenched, that they preceded my career choices or wedding conflicts or any specific incident I might have pointed to as the source of dysfunction. I spent Sunday afternoon writing in my journal, a practice I had maintained sporadically throughout my adult life, but which now felt necessary to process and document what I was experiencing. I wrote about the specific incidents from childhood and adolescence that now appeared in new context, moments when I had been criticized for achievements that should have generated celebration, times when my accomplishments were minimized while Vanessa's mediocrity was praised, instances when I was held to standards that were never applied to my sister. The patterns emerged clearly when viewed collectively rather than as isolated incidents, revealing systematic differential treatment that had shaped both of our developments in profound ways. I wrote about the emotional cost of maintaining relationships that required me to constantly minimize my own needs and perspectives, that demanded I accept treatment I would never tolerate in friendships or professional relationships, that insisted family obligations superseded basic requirements for mutual respect and reciprocity. I acknowledged the fear beneath my anger and hurt, the recognition that establishing firm boundaries might indeed result in permanent estrangement from parents and sister, that I might be choosing a future without the family I had been born into in exchange for protecting my own well-being and self-respect. But I also wrote about the possibility of building chosen family through deep friendships and authentic connections with people who valued me for who I actually was rather than who they wanted me to be, about the relief of no longer carrying the weight of relationships that required constant self-suppression, about the integrity of living according to my own values rather than performing compliance with expectations I found unjust or unreasonable. The prospect of life without my family of origin was frightening in its uncertainty, but the alternative of continuing to accept mistreatment in exchange for maintaining those connections had become untenable. As Sunday evening arrived and I prepared for the return to work the following morning, I felt simultaneously more vulnerable and more resolved than I had been at any previous point in my adult life. The revelations of the past week had stripped away comfortable illusions and forced direct confrontation with truths I had avoided acknowledging fully. My family was not simply flawed or complicated, but was actively willing to harm me when I refused to comply with their demands. The wedding conflict had exposed dynamics that would have continued operating beneath the surface indefinitely, if I had not finally established boundaries clear enough to trigger their vindictive response. Whatever came next, whether continued escalation or eventual exhausted withdrawal or something entirely unexpected, I would face it from a position of clarity about what I was protecting and why it mattered. I was no longer fighting to preserve relationships that had never served my actual well-being, but was instead defending my right to establish limits on how I would allow others to treat me regardless of biological connection. The shift from reactive self-protection to proactive boundary enforcement felt significant, a transformation from victim of family dysfunction to agent of my own liberation from patterns that had constrained me for decades. The upcoming week would bring new developments and challenges, responses from my family to boundaries I had established, and continued demands for compliance or explanations. But I was no longer operating from a place of hoping they would eventually understand or approve of my choices. I was operating from recognition that their understanding or approval was neither necessary nor particularly relevant to my right to make decisions about my own life, my own resources, and my own participation in relationships and events. The emotional impact of reaching this clarity was profound, a mixture of loss and relief, grief and liberation, ending and beginning all occupying the same space in my heart and mind as I moved forward into whatever came next. The week following my decision not to attend Vanessa's wedding began with a deceptive calm that I recognized immediately as the precursor to further escalation. Monday morning arrived with its usual demands of client meetings and document review, providing welcome structure and distraction from the family crisis that had consumed my weekend. I threw myself into work with the kind of focused intensity that had always served as both career advantage and emotional coping mechanism, grateful for intellectual challenges that had clear parameters and solutions, unlike the murky territory of family dysfunction where right answers existed only in relation to whose perspective held priority. My colleague James noticed my unusual intensity during our mid-morning case strategy meeting and asked with genuine concern whether everything was manageable. James was a senior associate who had been with the firm 3 years longer than me and had developed a reputation for both legal acumen and emotional intelligence rare in the often ruthlessly competitive environment of corporate law. We had worked together on several complex cases and had developed the kind of professional relationship that occasionally crossed into genuine friendship, though both of us maintained careful boundaries between work and personal life that our demanding schedules made necessary. I deflected his concern with vague references to family complications while internally debating whether to share more substantive details with someone outside my immediate circle. The isolation I felt was becoming increasingly difficult to manage alone. The weight of navigating this situation without support beyond my grandmother and my attorney creating strain that was beginning to affect my focus and energy. James seemed to sense there was more beneath the surface and suggested we grab coffee after the meeting concluded, an invitation framed casually enough that I could decline without awkwardness but extended with enough genuine warmth that I found myself accepting despite my usual preference for handling personal difficulties privately. We settled into a corner table at the coffee shop 2 blocks from our office building. The familiar bustle of legal professionals and tech workers grabbing afternoon caffeine providing enough ambient noise that our conversation would remain private despite the public setting. James waited patiently while I organized my thoughts, not pressing for immediate disclosure but making clear through his attentive silence that he was prepared to listen to whatever I chose to share. The decision to confide in him arrived with surprising ease, perhaps because the situation had reached a level of severity that maintaining complete privacy felt less important than accessing perspective from someone whose judgment I trusted, and whose professional background gave him framework for understanding legal harassment tactics. I laid out the entire timeline beginning with the initial phone call about Vanessa's wedding through my refusal to participate as a bridesmaid through the demand letter claiming my jewelry as my parents' property subject to recall. James listened without interrupting, his expression shifting from polite attention to genuine concern as the full scope of the situation became clear. When I finished explaining where things currently stood, including my decision not to attend the wedding at all and my engagement of Rebecca Chun to represent me if the property dispute escalated to actual litigation, he sat back in his chair with a long exhale that communicated both sympathy and professional assessment of the legal issues involved. His first response focused on validation that my decision to establish firm boundaries had been not only reasonable but necessary given the pattern of manipulation and escalation I had described. James noted that family law was not his area of expertise, but that the demand letter I had received appeared to constitute harassment rather than legitimate legal claim, that threatening litigation over property that had clearly been gifted years earlier suggested either that the attorney had been misled about the facts or was comfortable participating in abuse of legal process for client satisfaction. He offered to review the correspondence if I wanted a second opinion on the legal issues, and suggested that documenting everything carefully would be crucial if this situation continued to deteriorate in ways that required more formal intervention. Beyond the legal analysis, James shared his own experience with family estrangement that provided context I had not previously known despite our years of working together. He explained that he had not spoken to his father in nearly 8 years following a conflict that began with disagreement about James's choice to pursue law, rather than joining the family construction business, but had escalated into patterns of manipulation and control that eventually required complete separation for James to maintain his own mental health and professional trajectory. The estrangement had been painful initially, but had ultimately allowed him to build a life based on his own values and choices rather than constantly negotiating his father's expectations and disappointments. The disclosure surprised me both because James had never mentioned this aspect of his personal history, and because it challenged assumptions I had maintained about family estrangement being relatively rare or indicating some fundamental failure on the part of the person choosing distance. Here was someone I respected professionally and personally, someone who appeared to have healthy relationships and balanced life perspective, casually acknowledging that he had cut off contact with a parent and found that decision ultimately beneficial despite its difficulty. The normalization of what I had been treating as an extreme and potentially shameful outcome provided relief I had not realized I needed, permission to consider that permanent distance from toxic family members might be not just acceptable but actually wise and healthy. James offered practical advice drawn from his own experience navigating family estrangement while maintaining professional life and other relationships. He emphasized the importance of being selective about who I shared details with, noting that many people held such strong beliefs about family obligation that they would consistently pressure me toward reconciliation, regardless of the legitimate reasons for maintaining boundaries. He suggested preparing a brief explanation that provided enough information to satisfy curiosity without inviting unwanted advice or judgment, something along the lines of acknowledging family differences that had made continued close contact untenable, while making clear the decision had been carefully considered rather than impulsive or purely emotional. He also warned about the tendency toward guilt and second-guessing that would likely emerge during significant life events or moments of vulnerability, times when the absence of family would feel particularly acute, and when I might question whether the boundaries I had established were worth the cost of isolation from people who shared my history, even if they had consistently failed to support my present. James noted that these moments of doubt were normal, and did not necessarily indicate that the underlying decision was wrong, that it was possible to grieve the loss of relationships while simultaneously recognizing that maintaining those relationships would have required unacceptable compromise of personal integrity and well-being. Our conversation extended well beyond the 15-minute coffee break we had initially planned, stretching into nearly an hour of discussion that ranged from practical strategies for managing family holidays and social situations that might involve my parents through broader philosophical questions about what we owe to family members who harm us, and where obligation ends and self-protection legitimately begins. The exchange left me feeling simultaneously more grounded in my decisions and more aware of the long-term implications of the path I was choosing, understanding that this was not a temporary conflict that would blow over with time, but a fundamental restructuring of family relationships that would shape the rest of my life in ways I could not yet fully anticipate. Returning to my desk that afternoon, I found myself reflecting more deeply on the historical patterns that had created conditions for the current crisis. The wedding conflict and subsequent legal threats had not emerged from nowhere but represented the culmination of dynamics that had been developing throughout my entire life, patterns so gradual and consistent that I had internalized them as normal family interaction rather than recognizing them as systematically harmful treatment that warranted earlier intervention. The process of tracing these patterns backward through my personal history felt necessary for understanding not just what was happening now, but why I had tolerated problematic dynamics for so long before finally reaching a breaking point. My earliest clear memories of differential treatment between Vanessa and me dated back to elementary school. Subtle distinctions in how our achievements and struggles were received and responded to by our parents. When I brought home report cards showing straight A grades throughout 3rd and 4th and 5th grade, the response was typically brief acknowledgement followed by reminders not to become arrogant or overly focused on academics, at the expense of social development and physical activity. When Vanessa brought home report cards showing mostly B and C grades with occasional D marks in subjects she found challenging, the response was elaborate praise for her effort and reassurance that grades mattered, less than being a good person, and having friends who cared about her. The message embedded in these differential responses became clear over time, even if I lacked language to articulate it during childhood. My achievements were expected and therefore unremarkable, while Vanessa's mediocrity was celebrated as evidence of well-roundedness and appropriate priorities. I learned to minimize my own accomplishments in family settings, to downplay awards and recognition I received at school, to avoid discussing academic competitions or advanced placement classes, because drawing attention to these successes generated discomfort rather than celebration. Vanessa learned that she could receive abundant praise and attention for minimal effort, that being likable and socially successful mattered more than actual competence or achievement, that our parents would consistently make excuses for her shortcomings while holding me to standards that seemed to increase in direct proportion to my ability to meet them. Middle school and high school intensified these patterns as our different trajectories became more pronounced, and the implications more significant for our future opportunities. I was accepted into the gifted and talented program, took advanced mathematics and science courses, participated in academic competitions that required weekend travel and extensive preparation. My parents attended these events when required but always with visible reluctance, their discomfort palpable during awards ceremonies where other parents beamed with obvious pride while mine looked vaguely embarrassed by the attention. The implicit message was that I was showing off, that I was making others feel bad by excelling so visibly, that true grace would involve making myself smaller to avoid highlighting the gap between my achievements and those of my peers, including my own sister. Vanessa during these same years struggled academically despite tutoring and accommodations, eventually settling into a social identity based primarily on popularity and physical appearance, rather than intellectual accomplishment or particular talents. She was cheerful and outgoing, made friends easily, attended parties and social events that I had neither interest in nor particular aptitude for navigating. Our parents celebrated these social successes as though they were equivalent to or perhaps even more valuable than academic achievement, frequently commenting that Vanessa had emotional intelligence and interpersonal skills that would serve her better in life than my book learning and test-taking abilities. The college application process made these dynamics impossible to ignore even through the lens of childhood acceptance of family patterns as normal and inevitable. I had worked throughout high school toward the goal of attending a university with strong academic programs, had built a resume of achievements and activities designed to make me competitive for admission and scholarship consideration at schools that would provide foundation for the legal career I had already identified as my professional aspiration. My parents had watched this preparation with what I interpreted at the time as benign disinterest, but which I now recognized as active disapproval of ambitions they found threatening or incomprehensible. When I was accepted to Seattle University with a partial academic scholarship that would cover approximately 60% of tuition costs, my parents responded with immediate focus on the remaining financial gap, rather than celebration of the achievement. My father calculated quickly that even with the scholarship, 4 years of private university education would require either substantial parental contribution or significant student loan debt that I would carry for years after graduation. He suggested that I should consider community college for the first 2 years to save money, that I could transfer to a 4-year institution later, and still receive a degree from a respectable school without the burden of excessive debt. The suggestion felt like punishment for achievement rather than practical financial planning, particularly given that they had never expressed similar concerns about cost when discussing Vanessa's eventual college plans, despite her much weaker academic record and limited scholarship prospects. I pointed out this discrepancy as diplomatically as I could manage at 17, noting that if cost was the primary concern, then presumably both daughters would be encouraged toward more affordable educational paths. My mother's response revealed the underlying logic with accidental clarity. Vanessa would probably get married relatively young, and would not need to support herself independently for her entire adult life, so investing heavily in her education was less critical than ensuring she had pleasant college experience where she could meet appropriate potential partners and develop social networks that would serve her well in future domestic and community roles. The explicitly gendered and traditional nature of this reasoning shocked me even at 17. The casual assumption that my sister's value would ultimately derive from whom she married rather than what she accomplished professionally, that her education mattered primarily as credentialing for social positioning rather than for intellectual development or career preparation. The contrasting implication for my own situation was equally clear. Because I appeared unlikely to marry young or perhaps at all given my intense focus on academics rather than dating and social relationships, I needed to prepare for permanent financial self-sufficiency and therefore should minimize educational debt even if that meant compromising the quality of my undergraduate experience and preparation. I had chosen to attend Seattle University despite the financial concerns, working multiple part-time jobs throughout my undergraduate years, and accepting loan burden that I was still repaying more than a decade later. The decision had been framed as my choice and therefore my responsibility, with my parents contributing minimal financial support while making clear that they disapproved of what they characterized as my stubborn insistence on attending an expensive private institution when more affordable options existed. Vanessa 2 years later attended community college for a single year before transferring to the University of Washington, with our parents covering her housing costs and providing regular financial supplements for her living expenses without any apparent concern about teaching her financial responsibility or self-sufficiency. Law school had represented another inflection point where differential treatment became impossible to rationalize as anything other than systematic favoritism, rooted in fundamental disapproval of who I was and the choices I made. When I was accepted to the University of Washington School of Law, one of the top-ranked programs in the region with particular strength in areas I wanted to pursue professionally, My parents' response had been dominated by concern about additional debt burden and questions about whether law was truly the right path for me given my supposedly difficult personality and tendency toward confrontation, that they suggested might not serve me well in a profession requiring interpersonal negotiation and collaborative problem-solving. The characterization of my personality as difficult and confrontational stung particularly because it bore no resemblance to how I was perceived by professors, employers, or peers outside my family context. I had excellent relationships with faculty members who consistently described me as thoughtful and collaborative, had received positive feedback from supervisors in work and internship settings about my professionalism and team orientation, had maintained close friendships that suggested my interpersonal skills were more than adequate for building healthy relationships. The difficult and confrontational person my parents described existed only in interactions with them, a role I had been cast in because I sometimes questioned their decisions or expressed disagreement with their perspectives rather than automatically deferring to parental authority regardless of the merits of their positions. During my 3 years of law school, Vanessa had moved through a series of jobs and living situations with regular financial support from our parents who characterized their assistance as temporary help during a difficult transition period that somehow never ended. When she moved back into their house at 24, they welcomed her return as natural rather than concerning, never expressing worry that she was failing to develop the independence and self-sufficiency that adulthood required. When I occasionally raised concerns about this pattern during family gatherings, suggesting gently that perhaps more boundaries around financial support might ultimately benefit Vanessa by creating necessity for her to develop greater self-reliance, my observations were dismissed as jealousy or as evidence that I lacked understanding of Vanessa's more sensitive nature and different needs. The jewelry that was now subject to my parents' retrieval demands carried its own history embedded in these larger patterns of differential treatment. Each piece had been given during moments when I achieved something they could not easily dismiss or minimize, occasions when external recognition of my accomplishments was substantial enough that ignoring them entirely would have appeared strange to witnesses. The pearl necklace from Grandma Ruth at my college graduation had been presented in front of extended family and family friends, a celebration that required my parents to participate even if their enthusiasm seemed performative compared to how they had celebrated Vanessa's high school graduation 2 years earlier with an elaborate party and extensive gifts despite her mediocre academic record. The sapphire ring for my 21st birthday had been given at a restaurant dinner attended by both sets of grandparents and several aunts and uncles, another occasion where social expectation required demonstrating parental pride and generosity even if the underlying emotional reality was more complicated. I remembered my mother's face during that dinner, the smile that seemed forced as she watched me open the gift box and express genuine surprise and gratitude for the beautiful ring inside. I had attributed her expression at the time to normal maternal emotion, perhaps nostalgia about her eldest daughter reaching full legal adulthood or wistfulness about how quickly time passed. Looking back now with greater clarity about family dynamics, I recognize that expression as resentment poorly disguised as sentiment, discomfort with being required to celebrate my milestone in front of witnesses when she would have preferred to minimize the occasion. Each subsequent piece of jewelry I had received followed similar patterns, given during achievements that could not be ignored because external parties were paying attention and expecting appropriate parental response. My law school graduation, passing the bar exam, accepting my position at Pemberton and Associates, all had been marked with gifts that appeared generous, but which I now understood as currency in a transaction where my parents purchased the right to appear supportive while their actual feelings about my achievements remained ambivalent at best. The attempt to reclaim these items now represented not just legal harassment, but symbolic erasure of those achievements, a retroactive withdrawal of even the performative acknowledgement they had provided during the original gift-giving moments. Understanding this historical context made the current crisis feel simultaneously more painful and more clarifying. The wedding conflict had not created family dysfunction, but had simply brought existing patterns into such sharp relief that I could no longer rationalize or minimize them. My parents had been demonstrating for decades that they did not genuinely value my achievements, did not understand or respect my choices, did not view me with the unconditional positive regard that healthy parental love supposedly entailed. I had spent years trying to earn their approval through continued accomplishment, hoping that each new success would finally generate the response I sought, that eventually I would achieve something significant enough that they would recognize my worth and celebrate me the way they celebrated Vanessa for doing far less. The futility of this hope became fully apparent only when I stopped trying to meet their expectations and instead established boundaries based on my own needs and assessment of healthy relationship parameters. The immediate escalation to legal threats revealed what had perhaps always been true beneath the surface: pleasantries and obligatory family interactions. Their interest in maintaining relationship with me was contingent on my compliance with their preferences and expectations, that the moment I prioritized my own judgment over their demands, they were willing to employ whatever tactics necessary to reassert control or punish non-compliance. Tuesday evening brought a phone call from Aunt Diane, my mother's sister, who had sent the earlier email encouraging me to reconsider my decision about the wedding. Her tone this time carried less mediation attempt and more genuine concern, suggesting that she had learned additional information since her previous contact that had shifted her understanding of the situation. She began by apologizing for her earlier message, acknowledging that she had been operating with incomplete information provided by my mother, and had not fully appreciated the severity or complexity of what was occurring. Aunt Diane explained that Grandma Ruth had called her over the weekend and shared her perspective on family dynamics and the current crisis, including information about the pearl necklace and her concerns about how I had been treated compared to Vanessa throughout our lives. This conversation had prompted Aunt Diane to reflect more carefully on her own observations over the years, and to recognize patterns she had previously rationalized or dismissed as typical family complexity, rather than systematic problematic treatment of one child. She expressed regret that she had not intervened earlier or provided more active support when she witnessed these patterns, acknowledging that her desire to avoid family conflict had led her to remain silent when advocacy might have made difference. Her call represented the first indication that my position was gaining support beyond just my grandmother, that other family members were beginning to question the narrative my parents had been promoting about my unreasonableness and selfishness. Aunt Diane asked whether there was anything she could do to help, offered to mediate conversations if I thought that would be productive, and made clear that she would not be pressuring me toward reconciliation or compromise, but would instead respect whatever boundaries I determined were necessary for my own well-being. The support felt validating and slightly disorienting, requiring adjustment to a family landscape where I was not completely isolated in my perspective, but had at least some allies who recognized the legitimacy of my concerns and decisions. Wednesday brought another certified letter, this time from a different attorney whose name I recognized as practicing in family law and estate litigation. The correspondence informed me that this new attorney was now representing my parents in all matters related to the property dispute, that the previous attorney had apparently withdrawn from representation, and that this new counsel would be pursuing the matter more aggressively if I did not comply with the demand for return of jewelry within the previously specified timeline. The letter included additional items not mentioned in the original demand, expanding the claimed property to include a watch I had received for graduating law school, and a set of earrings given for my 30th birthday. The escalation to a new attorney suggested several possibilities, none of them particularly encouraging for prospects of de-escalation. Perhaps the original attorney had recognized the weakness of the legal claims, and had withdrawn rather than pursue frivolous litigation that could expose him to professional liability or sanctions. Perhaps my parents had been unsatisfied with his approach, and had sought someone willing to be more aggressive regardless of the legal merits. Perhaps this new expansion of claimed property represented an attempt to increase pressure through proliferating demands, creating sense that compromise was necessary because complete resistance would be too costly in terms of time, stress, and potential legal expenses. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.